Well, it's Monday again, and I'm calling this one Engineering Stuff and Other Random Discussions. And so let's jump into this thing and see what we can do. Sometimes you just got to take a picture of these cars. This 73 Mustang reminded me of a job I had to do a long time ago on a 351 Cleveland, you know, the big block. And it had popped the bolt off right there where the alternator goes in the, let me see if I can make a marker on that. Right where in this part of the head, that 3/8 bolt, that long 3/8 bolt that the alternator hinges on whenever you're adjusting the belt, had just broke off. Now sometimes that just seemed to happen. I had seen that happen on some Jeeps and other things. It can happen on any of, if it's got a little bit of wiggle there, like if the bolt wasn't tightened one time or another and it was jiggling and wiggling, it just metal fatigue and it pops off right there where it goes into the head. You can typically drill it out of there. But I was working on this one here under my carport when I lived down in Texas. That's a long time ago. And it reminds me this situation just like this, that this friend of mine I was working close to over there, he was another drivability guy. And he was drilling up in one of the bolt that was in the head. That's why the vehicle came in there, was to have that drilled out. So he was ordinarily sort of a calm and laid back kind of a guy. I think I mentioned this before in one of my previous videos, but he was drilling that bolt out, and the thing, his drill bit, I guess it was a 1/4 inch drill bit or whatever he was drilling up through it. He was drilling right up straight in the middle of that bolt, just beautiful, perfect like it was supposed to be. But he was using an electric drill. With an electric drill, you're more likely to, particularly if it's a corded electric drill, you're more likely to break a drill bit than you are if you're using an air drill. Although an air drill is hard to control the speed on it, so sometimes you heat it up and it quits drilling because everything gets hot and tempered. But the point is, the bit popped off. It broke, and he was running around waving his hands up in the air, saying, "I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know what I'm going to do." And that was totally out of character for him because he's usually a real laid-back kind of a guy. And I went over there and looked at it, and see, I didn't have an axe to grind because I didn't have a dog in the hunt anyway. I mean, it was his problem, wasn't my problem. But I said, "Why don't you take your air hammer and set it against that head right close to the, you know, sort of at an angle, because it was right there kind of on the corner." When it, you know, where he could get his air hammer. And so I said, just let it slug real slow, bop, 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 like that, and you will probably jar that bit loose and it'll come out of there, because it's only grabbing it on the front cutting edges anyway. It's not like you broke a tap off in there or something like that. And so he went ahead and did that, and that bit, you know, jarred loose, and he just rattled it right on out of there. And boy, he was just so happy about that. But that was funny. But you know, sometimes when you're not the one that's having to deal with it, you can think a little more clearly than the guy that is struggling, you know, because he's just, you know, he just kind of lost it there for a second because he didn't know what was going to happen. That same guy was complaining when he came in there one day. He said, "The sun is so bright out there that I went out there to check a nose start, and I couldn't tell if it had spark or not because the sun was shining so bright." And I just did a little word play in my mind, and I said, "You need one of those SSTs." SST, I've never heard of that. What is that all about? I said, shaded spark tester, you know. I made that up. I don't know if there's such a thing or not. There needs to be, though, for people that check nose starts in the sun. Anyway, what I did was, I got me a bracket here. See this bracket here that I made? Now, this is not perfectly drawn because it was this looks like it is not a perfect 90 degrees, but the one that I made was. And what I did was I drilled a hole up in here, and I put a longer bolt in that front intake bolt, which was the very front one up here, you know, right over that. It was right in this area right here, and that bracket went down like this, basically is where it went. Okay, so you can see right here where I took that original bolt, the one that was broke, and it snapped off, or there's a little bit of airspace right here because the bolt was supposed to go up in there, and I drilled a hole in the end of it. And I drilled a hole that was nice and snug in that plate. And so when I stuck this bolt through the alternator and it went through that plate, I put a cotter key in it right here. Okay, so when I put that cotter key in there, that bolt couldn't come back out of there, and it wasn't going to break off again. and I could adjust the alternator, and you know, of course, anybody that tried to take it both out would be confused because it'd be turning around and around. But that was something I did under my carport. Of course, at the time I had a drill press in my little utility room there by my carport, and I had an air compressor in the carriage house out behind the house, and I had the air was piped under the ground over there to where it was in there. Well, I didn't even have to listen to the air compressor. I went out and turned on the air compressor and closed the carriage house. I couldn't even hear an air compressor running. That's just really nice to have air that you can use without having to listen to that thumping air compressor, you know, if you got a small shop. But that was some engineering that I did. You know, this spacer right here is what's pictured here. You know, see that spacer right there? And that's this piece right here, that right there. So anyway, let me move on here. I can talk about that, you know, too long if I'm not careful. Now this guy right here is one of those people, and I see cars like this out there periodically, and I usually carry a camera with me in my vehicle just about all the time. I don't take hardly any of these pictures with my phone. I've got a good phone. It's got a 104 megapixel camera on it or something like that, but I have got a really nice camera with a telephoto lens that I keep out of sight where nobody will see it and steal it, and I can whip it up out of the back floorboard. It's a mirrorless camera, and so I can zoom in and snap a really high resolution picture of something. And this particular guy right here, he's just trying to get by. You know, people want to keep their cars going, and they have these little workarounds, and they do things to keep them running so that they can actually motivate around and get things done and, you know, go from point A to point B. And once again, like I said in a previous video, we don't have vehicle inspections in Alabama. You probably wouldn't be able to get away with this in a lot of other states that have stringent vehicle inspections. But you know, when I was living in Texas, I had to have my pickup truck inspected periodically. And occasionally, because I wasn't accustomed to that, I would forget it. And one time there was this lady that I loaned my truck to, and when she was driving it, she got pulled over and they gave her a $10 ticket, you know, because my truck hadn't been inspected. In other words, the inspection sticker was expired and all that. Well, the pin, tire gauge, magnet, laser, and flashlight in my pocket used to confuse some people that never really carried anything in their pocket. And I'm talking about people I would see at restaurants and stuff. One guy saw me and he was laughing at me because he thought I had a whole bunch of pins in my pocket. And the only two things that you might even talk about being pins is the Sharpie and the pen. There's actually a Sharpie has a different function than the pen. You know, we would use the Sharpie to write on the wall change stickers and other things, and I'd mark stuff that I was working with and all that. That raggedy old laser is one I bought from Radio Shack for $40 back in the day, and a screwdriver there. Sometimes I'd have one with a magnet on the back, sometimes I'd have one with these little valve core removers, and there's a tire gauge, and this is one of those little flashlights, Streamlight, that takes the quadruple A batteries, and it's not even as fat as a pin. I really love that thing. I've still got it over here. It works really well. But anyway, that was my pocket toolbox. Even there was an instructor down there in Tallahassee at a Ford, and when I went to school, I typically wore my uniform if it was going to be just like a one-day school, and I wasn't sure if I was going to be done in time to come back to work or not, because Tallahassee's not all that far from here. So I would come back. He called the stuff in my pocket a nerd pack, you know, and all that. And there was time, you know, back in the day when I would wear a pocket protector. Only problem with that was the pocket protector always tries to fall out of your pocket, seemed to me like. So I just went ahead and stuck these in my pocket. And the people that made fun of me for carrying all this stuff in my pocket were always the ones that wanted to borrow my pocket screwdriver or maybe my pocket magnet. Oh yeah, this was a pocket magnet here. I've had various different ones of those. Anyway, now Mike was a friend of mine that I knew. He's a lot older than me. I think he was in the second grade when I was born or something. And he bought a brand new 70 model Chevelle. It was almost his same color, except his was a bluer than this one. That one's kind of green there. But this looked just like the one he had, except it didn't have these things on the hood, right? I mean, his was basically factory, except he put some wheels on it that he got from somewhere that he thought were dressier than the wheels that came on it. And the problem he kept having with those was they kept coming off. He would drive along, they'd get loose, and occasionally one of them would run off, and he would wind up having to, you know, go and get the wheel and, you know, put it back on there. It's amazing he never had an accident on that thing. I never did know until years later, because at the time this was going on, I wasn't but about, 14 years old, 15, something like that. I knew he was having a problem, and I actually encountered him a couple of times when I was riding my horse or my bicycle or whatever I was traveling on that day, and I'd see him out there putting a wheel back on his car. Well, the thing about it is, his problem was, and I found this out later when I started professionally mechanicking for money. I mean, I worked for my dad, didn't get paid for that. But anyway, he had, if you've got a wheel that is set up for these 60-degree lug nuts and you put 45-degree lug nuts or vice versa, then the wheels are going to come off. They're going to work loose and come off. There was this guy that sent me an email about a Grand Cherokee he had, and the left front wheel kept coming off, and then he would torque it with a torque wrench and everything to try to get it to stay on there, and it kept coming loose. And so I told him in my return email, I said, what you need to do is take one lug nut off of each one of the other wheels and put those on there, and that will stop that. And then you need to make sure you get the proper lug nuts, because he had the factory wheels, but somehow or another he had wound up with some screwy lug nuts that weren't the right ones. Now, whatever happened to his original lug nuts, I can't remember. He didn't ever say or something. But anyway, whenever he put one of the lug nuts off each of the other wheels on there and replaced his lug nuts, he called me, or he actually didn't call me. He sent me an email back and said that took care of my problem, and I had asked a lot of other people about it. Nobody knew what to tell me. Wasn't that complicated, but typically it's hard to look at those lug nuts and tell that the angle is wrong if all you've got to look at is the lug nut and the wheel. But you got to have lug nuts that match the taper on the wheel, and that's what this is about. Now, I bought one of these things, this SuperChips, just horsing around. Sometimes I buy stuff for research, because of the money that I make writing and stuff like that. I need something to write off. And so I got this thing, and it comes in this little box right here. Look at that. This thing is fuzzed out because I've got my thing where it's fuzzed out. I got to hold it where it's in front of my face. Anyway, that fuzzy thing works crazy. But that's this Flash Paq thing. And I got it you got to have it, whatever the first vehicle you set it up for is the one that whenever you put the program in there to change it for, premium gas and different shifts pulling a trailer or whatever, it saves your old programming so that if you want to, you can return to what you had. And on this one here, just horsing around, I figured I would go ahead and do the fuel economy upgrade just because. Now, I will tell you, these people have done a lot of work on this, and it's only going to give you about a 7% increase in fuel economy, which doesn't sound like a lot. But checking my mileage, I found out that it pretty much did what they said it was going to do. Now, it's not going to be no miracle thing, where you plug it in and you get an extra 15 or 20 miles to the gallon or whatever, any hogwash like that. It is kind of funny, though, how I could take something that was just really nothing but just a piece of whatever, something that looked official. Like I had one of those little things you click around a cord to, stop it from having RFI. And I would take that thing out there and I'd say, now this is a special thing and it's going to align the fuel molecules on your gas, and I'm going to click it around the fuel line going where it goes into your fuel rail. And I want you to drive this thing for a week and run 2 or 3 tanks of gas through it, however long it takes you to do that, and tell me if this helps your fuel economy. And about 6 times out of 10, the people that had that thing on there would come back and say, it gave me another 3 miles to the gallon. I couldn't believe it. And it was a placebo effect, because if people know they're checking their fuel economy with some new device, they're typically going to drive a little more carefully, and it was always funny to me because whenever I was doing it to see how they would react and if it would make any difference, and about a little over half the time it did. Now, some people would forget it was on there and just drive like they always did, but most of the time fuel economy stuff is tied up in the way people drive anyway. We had this device that we had got for checking fuel economy on vehicles whenever I was working at Ford dealer, and it was this bottle that would hang outside the window, and you'd have to pipe it in there and hook it between your gas line and fuel pump and all that. And what you would do is you would turn this valve and let the fuel pump fill this thing up, and it was 1/10 of a gallon, and then you would turn the valve again so that the only fuel that vehicle was using was coming out of this glass bottle that was hanging on the windshield. And we would, I mean on the side window, and we would drive that thing, and you could look at a number of miles you went. Like if it went 1.9 miles, that was 19 miles to the gallon, because you're multiplying whatever is in there by 10, see, because you're burning 1/10 of a gallon. And this one guy, I would let the customer ride with me while I was doing this, and let them look at the odometer and let them write the numbers down while I was doing the driving. And the thing about it is, even on one of these F-150s, you know, like back in the late 80s, early 90s, if you drove that thing like you were afraid you were going to tear it up real gently all the time, it was amazing what kind of fuel economy you could get out of one of those trucks. Now my wife's pickup truck is a 2016 model with the aluminum body. It's like 700 pounds lighter than my '07, and her pickup's got the little V6 3.5, but it's not EcoBoost, and it gets like 28 miles to the gallon on the highway, which is pretty amazing, because my old Grace '07 model gets about 17 or 18 on a good day, you know, and that's if I drive it really careful. But I used this SuperChips thing on my Explorer, and it's pretty pricey. I mean, you're going to pay a few $100s for it, but anyway, I just figured I'd go ahead and give that a shot. Now, I had a little engineer a quick fix on an Explorer when I was working at the Ford dealer. I got called to the write-up area. This guy said, sometimes I have sluggish acceleration and a lot of pinging, labor knock, like it's bad gas or something. Doesn't do it every time. He said, usually I can switch it off and start it back up and it'll be just fine. But he says it might not do it for the next 10 times I drive it. Without warning, it'll do it whenever I'm driving it, and it's scary to me because I'm afraid I'm going to mess the engine up. And so they had called me to the write-up area, which they did that quite a bit. So they have me out there consulting with the customer to see what maybe we needed to do or something like that. And so I went out there, and I just got to thinking about what he said, and it's a quick and easy check. I just took the air cleaner off, and I looked, and laying on top of the air filter, now you know the air comes in from the bottom, so that's what's supposed to stop the dirt. Laying on top of the air filter was the wing of a cockroach. And that was really interesting to me, that it was laying in there, and that's all that was in there. Now, he had a nice late model shiny vehicle at the time. And you might notice his mass airflow had a screen like this, and when this roach's wing would pop up and it would land on that screen right in front of that place where the air was supposed to go through, because that screen's pretty close, it would deflect the air from going through there. It would show less air than what was actually going into the engine, and it would cause it to run really, really lean, and it would be like, you know, losing power, pinging, labor knocking, that sort of thing. And so that was one that I fixed. It only took 5 minutes to fix it, and I didn't even charge him anything. You know, which, if I'm not going to go in there and say, okay, I'm going to look at your air cleaner and all and charge you an hour and a half, 2 hours to look at all this junk. I mean, I said, let's just go ahead and get this guy straightened out and get him out of there. And he basically took and drove it, and he drove it for a couple of weeks. He came back perfect. It's beautiful. It's fixed. I really appreciate it. That guy was a lifelong customer, see, because he didn't go in there and get charged $400 or $500 or $600 for throwing a bunch of parts at it. He saw me surgically repair it right there in front of him, you know. And this customer watching you thing, I will admit that sometimes I don't like customers watching me, and sometimes I don't mind. It depends on the customer. Some of them are watching you because they're afraid you're going to make a mistake and they want to, you know, micromanage. Some of them are just basically out there because they're friendly. And so, but this guy wasn't in my service bay. I was out there in the write-up area doing this. Now, this is a handy wrench extender. My buddy that owns a tire store over here bought this thing, and he just loves it. You know, everybody that's done very much wrench work has locked a box end wrench into the open end of another wrench to give yourself more. And there was this girl that was really strong that I had that worked out there at the school. She was going through my program, and she said there was these guys were trying to break this lock nut loose on a tie rod end because they were doing a wheel alignment. And she says, they said, I can't break this nut loose. So what do we need to do? And it was a 7/8, you know. And I said, Jennifer, come over here and see if you can break this nut loose. And now Jennifer was a big, heavy girl, and she had big, meaty hands for a girl, and her hands were really, really strong. As a matter of fact, just about any guy I had in there, she could probably knock him on the rear end. But anyway, she got that thing, and I was watching it with my pocket flashlight up there while she was on that nut. and she was turning it the right way because I made sure she was turning it the right way. And she started putting her weight and pulling on that thing, and she was using a Craftsman 7/8 wrench. And that Craftsman 7/8 wrench, it started to spread the jaws on that wrench. And I could tell she was going to round it off. And that was going to be a big problem. So what I did was, I went and got some valve grinding compound, which is one of my favorite things to have. And I smeared valve grinding compound all over that nut, where it would, you know, it was the gritty stuff. And so she slid that wrench back up on that, and she was able to break it loose because it had more bite with that valve grinding compound on there. And every now and then you'll find something that's just tight and you don't know why. But I got this little screen print right here off Amazon. You can buy one of these things on Amazon for like $37, and there's some other variations of it too. All right, this is what we do. Speaking of valve grinding compound, when the Allen is rounded out, I had this Bronco that was a trainer vehicle, and I would, you know, have them. We would take it apart and pull the transfer case down and all that junk. And so we always have to pull this 1/2-inch pipe plug out that was an Allen, and we would fill it up with oil and all that, or have them check the oil. Well, eventually it got rounded out to the point to where, what are we going to do? So I got a T60 Torx bit, you see that, and I put a bunch of valve grinding compound up in there. The Torx bit will bite in an Allen better if it's the right size to go in there. And I knocked that thing in there real gently with a hammer, and we could put it, and it just bit into that rounded out plug and brought it right on out of there. And so that's just a little trick, a little engineering trick right there. Now, I saw this one at the parts store the other day. This is another one that's smashed up, but it's still growing. I mean, this window right here has been replaced with plastic, and this tail light has been taped over with red tape, so they'll still have a nice red tail light. And somebody, either rear-ended them or something. I don't know. This thing looks like it took some impact in the back. This is a Scion. You can make that little symbol out there. SCIO is one of those. But they were still driving it, and so it's just one of those things where people are doing whatever they have to do to get by, and used cars now are worth more than they used to be. So rather than going into debt, this person is doing the smart thing and doing the best he can with what he's got. And you got to have respect for that, Now, this 6-year-old battery on my wife's 2016 F-150 had to be replaced. I kept checking it with my tester, with my BT608 or whatever it is that I got. That Altel thing is really a good battery tool. I need to feature a video on that. I've mentioned it on here before. But what I did was, I said, I'm going to pull this out of here and going to take it to the Ford place and buy another battery, because the battery was 6 years old. If you notice, the date on this thing was, it says, let's see, 7/18/2016. See, this is the 18th, and that's the 7th month, and it's 2016. So that's how old that battery was. And this was only about 2 or 3 weeks ago I changed this thing. One of the things that, we typically don't drive this truck all that much. But I noticed one day when it was kind of chilly weather and we went to start it up, if you're paying attention to how your vehicle sounds when you start it, you can hear it go like you can tell. And if you've got a battery that manages to start the car every time but it struggles to spin it, you're actually going to damage your starter eventually, because low voltage will wipe out a starter, believe it or not. And so it's a really good idea. One time, that 58 model Volkswagen I had came with a 6-volt starter, and I converted it over to 8 volts. I converted the whole car to 12 volts, not 8 volts. And I asked my dad, what are we going to do about that starter? Because a 12-volt starter won't fit this 58 Volkswagen transaxle, because that's where it went in. He said, just drive it with that 6-volt starter. It'll spin a lot faster, but it ain't going to hurt it. I never had a problem with that starter. Boy, would that thing ever spin that little motor over. Pretty cool. But what else I wanted to show you was, I got one of these, these bricks that you carry around in your car that jumps off vehicles. And it's always good to have one of those. You need one of these on hand in your vehicle. I have actually started several people's cars that were in a pickle. Didn't have to open the hood, didn't have to get my jumper cables out, just got this little jump starter brick, hooked it up to their car. This lady at the post office, I saw her out there with a dead battery on a little Chevrolet Spark or whatever it was. And she's a little old white-haired lady. And I went over and said, hey, The car ain't starting. She said, well, it just started just fine before I came over here, but I don't know why it won't start now. I said, it sounds like you got a bad battery. And so I says, let me jump you off. And there was a guy standing there watching. And I just walked over to my Explorer, and I got a little brick here, and I carried it and connected it, to her spark. And the guy was looking confused because he didn't know what in the world I was doing. This thing didn't look like much. The little cables on it and all. And the lady was sitting in her car, and I said, all right, go ahead and start it. And she fired it up. It's really funny how that guy reacted. He goes, what the heck is that thing? He'd never seen one before. But those things have saved my bacon. One time the battery on my Explorer, one morning when I had driven down there to teach at that program in the town down the road, I launched a new program, and I'd go there in the morning and teach, and I'd go to the regular college and teach. And one morning I got ready to leave, and the battery, and it was a fairly not that old of a battery, maybe a year or two old. That thing just was like there was no battery there anymore. I mean, it had opened up, had an open circuit on the inside of the battery, I guess. Happened without warning. Started up just fine at home, drove it down there. Actually was going to change the oil, and it had one of the students, I said, go get my vehicle and pull it in here on this drive on lift. And he went there and he said, what's the trick to starting? And I said, what are you talking about? He said, it won't start. And when I turned on the key, it wouldn't even burn a light. It's like somebody had disconnected the battery cables. I opened it up, nobody had been under there, and that battery was just totally inoperative. I took my little brick, this little thing here, and I hooked it up to that, and used it for a battery, and drove the vehicle all the way, like for 45 minutes to the college, and then from the college another 30 minutes, and I came back by the Ford place, and I got a replacement battery for the one because that battery wasn't that old. But what I did on this is I took this thing and I connected it from ground to the big alternator post. And on most vehicles, this will keep all of your electrical alive so you don't lose your radio station presets or your adaptive learning and all that kind of hogwash. It's really a pretty good way to do that if you can get to it. Now, you can't always get to the big post on the alternator, but if you can, and you got one of these things, that works pretty good. They have these things that you can, that's got a 9-volt battery in it you can plug into the cigarette lighter, but if the cigarette lighter is one of those that goes dark whenever you turn off the key, the cigarette lighter is not going to power up everything on the car because it's only, so, I mean, that's only a good part of the time. They also make some that will plug into your OBD port for this purpose and all that. And so one way or another, this is the way I decided to do this one, and it worked out okay. This right here is Suncoast Technical College in Sarasota, Florida. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with ConsuLab training aids, but I get commissioned periodically to travel to another place and repair a ConsuLab training aid. There was a couple of air conditioner trainers down here that they had at Suncoast Technical College that had developed some leaks, and I had to drive down to Sarasota, which is about 7 hours from here, and fix those two. I mean, I got paid to do that. And while I was down there, I was totally amazed how beautiful Suncoast Technical College is with all of its, really nice shop and everything. And so I just wanted to shoot you a picture of that. If you're in that area, that's a good place to go and get trained. They've got an enrollment of probably 125 students. They got 4 instructors, and they got every possible thing you can imagine to teach you how to fix a car down there. So that is a really good technical college.
Move but one way, see?
This right here, the U-joint, it was, you can't tell if you got a vibration that you think might be a U-joint. You usually cannot tell if you've got a bad U-joint without taking the U-joint off and seeing if it will move freely in both directions. This one moves freely in one direction, but in the other direction, it's real stiff. And so we had to replace the U-joint on this one. I've actually replaced U-joints in a parking lot in Houston, Texas with a block and a hammer and a drift and a screwdriver. You can do it if you know how to do it. It's not that hard on most vehicles. This right here, ever hit a situation where the spark plug was down in a well, like on a Crown Victoria or a lot of these other cars, and you couldn't get the socket on the plug? Well, the students were complaining they couldn't get the plug, and there was trash down in the hole, and so that you absolutely could not get a socket on this plug. And I had already told these guys, before you ever pull the spark plug wires out of those wells on one of these engines that has the spark plug going out of the wells, especially if it's one of the V engines, make doggone sure you blow all that trash out around those spark plug wires, because if the wrong thing falls in there and it manages to make it into the into the cylinder, you know, this is a disastrous situation that could cause you to have to pull a cylinder in. Now, we did have to put a long snout blower down in here and blow all this junk out of here so we can get the plug out. But always blow the top of that engine off and get the dirt and the crud and any piece of trash that may be laying up in there off before you ever pull the plug out. That's just a smart thing to do, fellas. This right here, this, you know, these mufflers have got a little weep hole so that the water that's being made by the engine, you know, you make a gallon of water for every gallon of fuel you burn. That's why you see steam coming out the tailpipe whenever it's real cold in the winter on your car. Even if there's nothing wrong with the car, you're making water, so you're seeing steam coming out the pipe. Well, so that water won't puddle up in the muffler, they put a little hole in the muffler. Well, in this particular one, that hole was blowing the moisture of the exhaust right on this. I guess that hole rotted out a little bit or something. I don't remember. I should have took a picture from the other side, you know, from this direction here, if looking back. Anyway, the point is, the reason that that suspension part is so screwed up and rusty is because that muffler was blowing that moisture on it all the time, and it eventually started to attack that. Now you can see if that went far enough, you might lose this arm here, or you know, it might begin to buckle, and you might, you know, cause sudden issues. Now this is an affordable old OTC Nemisys. It was not a two-way talker. In other words, you couldn't send commands and get things to do with it, but it was a really functional little scan tool. When I bought this one that I carried in my truck for a long time, I paid like $550 for it, which is really reasonable. And it was just really a high quality tool. As a matter of fact, you could actually get it set up so you could specifically put in the serial number on the vehicle, or it could read the serial number if it was new enough, and it would actually go in there and give you all of these enhanced codes, right? Now you can see this one here, these rich things was related to this. See what I'm saying? I mean, there were some adaptive learning issues, but you've also got this interesting little code right here. I don't remember what vehicle that was on, but I was just want to talk a little bit about that Nemisys. They don't make the Nemisys anymore. You might be able to buy one from eBay or something. My buddy Donnie, though, was looking for something he could use at his shop to pull codes from OBD1 vehicles. And I had this thing, and I bought a different scan tool, and I didn't know when I'd ever need to look at anything OBD1 again. So I sold him this scan tool, and it was nearly brand new. I hadn't used it all that much. And he uses that on Dodges and on just anything. And it's got several adapters in there. The Dodge, particularly the domestic ones, are the ones that it's the best on. You know, some of the, like in '95, there were some Camaros that were OBD1, but they had an OBD2 link under the dash and crap like that. So anyway, that was I sold it to Donnie. This is that temporary window fix I was talking about. I wish I'd have found this picture when I was doing that production thing on power windows. But what we did was we notched the top of this and we put it under the glass so it held it up. Put a wire tie on it to hold it in place, and we basically kept the window up until we could get the parts in. You know, you don't want the window falling down in the door so it's going to rain on them, or they got to drive with the wind in their face and all that kind of stuff. If it's cold weather or whatever, or if it's hot weather, you know, you want the air conditioner to work. Anyway, that was one that we did that. We put that on. Now, I have seen these odd things happen where the power steering on some vehicles, it doesn't happen a whole lot. On some vehicles, the power steering fluid will go low when you don't know where it went. One time, this guy named Mark was over there working with me, and he's the one that got mad because I raised the door and wouldn't let it down because he wouldn't change the radio station. You might remember that story. Anyway, he was checking the power steering fluid in the shop for him and went over, and he says, well, you had to fill up the power steering fluid. And he goes, yeah. He said, well, where did the old fluid go? He said, well, it doesn't have any leaks that I can see anywhere. And he says, well, where did the fluid go? He said, well, have you ever heard of evaporation? I've seen this. Occasionally, though, what will happen is if it's got rack and pinion, the fluid will leak into that accordion boot, And it may not leak out of the boot. It may be contained in that boot, and you don't really know until that boot starts to swell up and look like a balloon. You don't, because there's not supposed to be any oil in that accordion boot on the rack, on a rack and pinion rack. And occasionally it'll, you know, whenever you see it leaking out of there, usually it will. But occasionally those clamps will be tight enough, and that boot will be sound enough to where it'll go low on fluid a couple of times before you realize what's going on. There's other times though that that's not happening, but it goes low on fluid, and it's just sort of peculiar trying to figure out what in the world is going on with it. This is a funny little thing I did. One day the English professor at the college, he had found this. What this is it's a picture of these firefighters. Somebody's burning an old building down, and these firefighters are over there, and they stationed them out there with an ice chest and some cold drinks and all, so that if this got out of hand, this burning this building, they could actually contain the fire. Well, it didn't look like anything was happening, so these guys were just kind of hanging around. Well, the English instructor found this in the paper, and he basically had just typed something on a piece of white paper and taped this to it, and he showed it to me laughing about it because he wanted to make fun of the diesel instructor. And it says, diesel technology students enjoy break after learning safety tips for storing flammable chemicals. And I says, I can make that look like a real newspaper article. So I did, and I emailed it to everybody on the campus. And you know how it'll have the little photo, I mean, somewhere on here, and I don't remember where I put it. I put the name of the English instructor on there, and I went, you know, photo John, whatever was his last name. And one of the ladies from the office called him and asked him what newspaper he wrote for. She thought this was a real a real story. I had such a good time with that. This was sent to me by a friend, the adjunct instructor I had that still teaches at the college. And somebody used duct tape and a bunch of screws to try to fix the leak on a tire. It's amazing what some people will do. The ignition switch fire hazard on some of these, you know, there's a bunch of these Ford ignition switches that were made like this and that were coming apart. And sometimes whenever you went to unplug the ignition switch, you wouldn't know that it had started to come apart until, you know, the white part came off and it's all in your hand flopping around, and you got to put another switch on it. Well, they had a, on the late 80s Ford pickups, they were these things coming apart. Only on those they recalled it because it could cause a fire. And I don't know how many of them. I think they recalled 8,000 F-150s and maybe Broncos at the time for us to replace the ignition switch on. Now, this one here is real similar to one of those trucks, but the truck ones had the bolts that, I mean, what held it in there was 11 millimeter nut, you know, and you had to break that thing loose and, you know, adjust it right and all that kind of thing when you put it back on, because it had slotted holes in the switch. And I could change one of these pretty fast once you've done a lot of them, you know. It's just pretty easy to do. But the problem with the fire, we actually had one on the front end lift that the ignition switch failed the way they were talking about in that recall. And he had it about halfway up on the lift, and somebody said, hey, this truck's on fire out here. And we stepped out of the parts room and looked over there, and there were flames right above the ignition switch licking up out of the dash, and they'd already cracked the windshield and making a mess about the total of that truck. And so he went over there, and we got a fire extinguisher and put it out. But that was one, I actually saw one like that. There was another problem that some of the Explorers had, that they did a recall for it, that the power mirror switch could catch fire. And there was a guy that bought a brand new Explorer, and I think it was a 94 model, the last of the square ones. And he went over there to the cell phone place, and they put a cell phone in it. And then he went to another place, and the thing caught fire and just destroyed that vehicle. I mean, it was ruined whenever it got through. And initially, it looked like the cell phone people might have been responsible, but it turned out it was that mirror switch in the door that had done that, and there was a recall on that. What they had us doing on that was we'd go in there and we would actually put an inline fuse in there, so that if something happened to that switch, it would pop that fuse instead of melting the switch down and setting the truck on fire. Now, if you've ever got a fuel gauge that was questionable because you didn't know if you could trust it or not, you got a no start, you could hear the fuel pump running, You can take the relay out. This is looking at the relay socket right here. Take the relay out, get your meter, set it on amps so that the current's flowing through the meter to the fuel pump, right? Now, if you've got a fuel pump module, fuel pump control module and all that, it's obviously not going to work. But on the ones that have the fuel pump directly driven by a relay, if you can get some power and feed it to that pump through your meter, and if it's only pulling like 1.5 amps, you're out of gas. If it's pulling like 4 to 8 amps, that means it's pumping gas. It could be pumping water or something, or some other fluid that wouldn't start the truck. But this is just a little trick that I came up with whenever I was, not sure. The gas gauge didn't say it was out of gas, didn't have any fuel pressure, but you could hear the pump. You just want to make sure. It just doesn't take long to do. It doesn't cost much. Gives you some good information that you can use as a data point. And I don't know how many other times we did this. Well, until next week, I really appreciate you guys coming around, and I really appreciate you watching my videos. And I will see you next time I make one. Give me a little feedback. Let me know if I helped you out with this one. See you later.